welcome everyone officially. This is Visegrad Insight Transatlantic Breakfast. We give the opportunity for our readers and subscribers and friends across the Atlantic also to join us and to take part in discussion on Central Europe, from Central Europe. This is Visegrad Insight, the main platform analysis and debate in the region. And that's the way how we encourage everyone to look through the prism of Central Europe on sometimes on global events, but this particular one is on very peculiar situation in Poland. This is the presidential election, the vote taking place, as you know, on Sunday, first round, and there is an expectation there will be a second round, and that would be held in 2 weeks' time later on. Now, we have great speakers today. Before I just go into introducing both of them, let me explain again shortly rules. We keep our mics off for most of the discussion. We had some 70 people registered. I believe maybe we can expect some 50 of us being present today. The first part is on the record, the second part is off the record. You are all encouraged to give comments and questions throughout the whole discussion through chat box, and I'll try to pick them up and read them, or signal through chat, through waving in the video box, or using Zoom functions to signal to me that you want to have an interaction with all of us and give your questions or very short comments. We're under time pressure, so that we have a very lively discussion following the introductions. Now, we're joined today by Aleks Szczerbiak, from the professor of political science at the University of Sussex, a great political scientist and commentator, also nearly live blogging on Polish politics with an excellent blog. Anyone who wants to follow will send the link. And Renata Mieńkowska, Warsaw University, a professor, also political science, and a commentator in European media as well, for Polish politics and developments here, mostly in the country. Both of them will deliver short opening remarks. That will kick off our discussion later on. That will try to foresee what's at stake, what is really at stake for Poland, what's at stake for PIS government and Andrzej Duda, and what's at stake also from the point of view of the opposition. So I think we have excellent insiders. Aleks has enormous knowledge on and understanding of PIS camp. Renata took a lot of time. She just mentioned she was talking also now, just before, to the staff of one of the presidential candidates. We'll hear a lot of insights from them. So we start now, and Aleks, please go first.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be speaking at this forum. I looked at the guest lists, and there's lots of familiar friends and also a really distinguished group of participants. So I'm hoping it's going to be a really good discussion. I'm a British academic, so I should start with an apology. And my apology is going to be about my hair, because it's a real mess. And our hairdressers don't open until July the 4th in Britain. And I'm going to probably have to wait 6 weeks after that. So for those of you who are used to seeing with slightly better kept hair, I've not reverted back to the 1970s. It's simply that we're in lockdown, so I can't get my hair cut. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about two things. Wojciech's asked me to talk about what is at stake in the election from the perspective of the ruling party, the governing camp, and the incumbent president. And I'm going to talk about Andrzej Duda's strengths and weaknesses as a candidate as we enter, as we're in this final week of the campaign leading up to the first round. So what's at stake for Law and Justice in this election? Well, quite simply, if Andrzej Duda wins, they have a 3-year run where they're in control of all the main levers of power, the institutions of the state, in order to complete their program, their radical program of state reconstruction, Dobra Zmiana, as it's called, which they've been pursuing for the last 4.5 years. So they will continue with the judicial reform program. The balance of the Supreme Court will continue to change as new justices are appointed and approved by the president. If necessary, they can push through any laws that they need to in order to push through their legislative reform program. They're likely to undertake some kind of reform of the media. At the moment, the Law and Justice's main strength in the media is the public media, is state TV, but they think this is very, very brittle. Still overwhelmingly, they think the public media is against them, and certainly would be if they lost the election. So their foothold in terms of the mass media is very brittle. So they're likely to do something to try and change the private media landscape. And particularly something targeted at the foreign-owned media. There's likely to be some kind of local government reforms, I would have thought. I mean, at the moment, you know, a lot of local authorities, local mayors are controlled by the opposition. At the same time, as vast sums of funds, EU regional funds, for example, or the funds from the EU Recovery Fund, are channeled through local authorities, so there's likely to be some move to try and increase the powers of the government's appointed regional administrators. And I think the other thing that's possibly at stake is a change in the attitudes in political elites and possibly business and public administration. I mean, in terms of the political elites, I think, you know, there's a not impossible chance if Law and Justice was to find itself holding all the levers of power, that there could be members of the opposition in the Senate, where Law and Justice is currently in a minority, who defect, who come over to the government side. Similarly, in the regional authorities, where the governing party controls roughly half of those, the powerful regional authorities, there's a chance that certain opposition members, or possibly even, you know, a whole party like the PSL, the Peasant Party, could switch over to Law and Justice, which would obviously give them control of more regional authorities. But also, I think, you know, there's a lot of people in public administration, a lot of business people who I think have been kind of, you know, hedging their bets up until now. I mean, they're not really kind of sure where things are going to go. And if it's clear that Law and Justice is going to be in power for the next 3 years and it's got, you know, holds all the levers of power, I think those people will start to move over to the governing camp. And I think that the governing camp is also hoping that that will be the attitude of a lot of the international community, particularly the EU political establishment, the major EU powers, the Commission. If they know they have to deal with a Law and Justice government that's very firmly entrenched for the next 3 years, then pragmatically they will develop a different, a more constructive, a less critical relationship of them. Obviously, if Andrzej Duda loses, if Rafał Trzaskowski or an opposition candidate wins, well, the problem here, of course, is, I mean, I don't need to tell you that they don't have a 3/5 majority in Parliament, so it would be very difficult for the government to get through its legislative programme. The thing about the Polish constitution is a lot of the powers of the president, or most of the powers of the president, are negative. Okay, they're powers to stop things, and the most important of these is the legislative veto power. And Law and Justice doesn't have the 3/5 majority that it needs to overturn the veto, so it would be a disaster for the party in terms of its legislative programme. But also certain appointments. I mean, for example, you know, Rafał Trzaskowski could not ratify certain judicial appointments, which would slow down the process of changing the composition of the Supreme Court. The problem here is that I think if Rafał Trzaskowski were to win, we would find ourselves in a very turbulent, potentially very unstable period of cohabitation, which could possibly lead to an early parliamentary election. I mean, you know, this is a government that's not simply interested in administering. Okay, it wants to govern, not just administer. And I think this will be the problem. If it found itself in a position where it was very difficult for it to get through its legislative programme or key elements of its state reconstruction programme, I think it will be very difficult for, I think, you know, an early election would certainly be an option. What's Andrzej Duda's strengths and weaknesses? Well, I think his biggest strength is the genuine support that he has in small town provincial Poland. He is really popular in those areas. When he speaks at rallies there, you know, it is a genuine enthusiasm, which gives him a really strong base. You know, that 40% core that he has in the opinion polls, which will, you know, get him through to the next round of the election, is based on a real genuine support that he has in small town provincial Poland, which he's been working on from day one of his presidency. His promise to visit every powiat, every county, which he has fulfilled, you know, provides him with a real strong electoral base. So I think, you know, that's his first strength. His second strength is the credibility that he has because of his association with the popular social spending pledges that the Law and Justice government has introduced. Now, opposition candidates, obviously, you know, they pointed out that, you know, he hasn't implemented all his pledges, you know, and they're obviously correct about that. But the high-profile pledges on the 500-plus benefits program, the cutting the retirement age, you know, the real headline spending pledges the government implemented, and he has and he is associated with. Put simply, Andrzej Duda is associated with a government and a party who, on the socio-economic issues that polls care most about, has delivered, and in the eyes of most voters has been the most credible. Okay, so that's his, I think, enormous strength. In terms of his weaknesses, well, one of the funny things about Polish politics is that things that are a source of strength are also a source of weakness, and it's exactly the same with Rafał Trzaskowski, I would say. And Andrzej Duda's biggest source of weakness, if a source of his strength is an association with a government that's delivered on a socio-economic program that's very popular, the biggest source of his weakness is that he is very closely identified with the governing party at a time when the balance of opinion in terms of the government is very evenly divided. Okay, so there are lots of people that might like him personally, but will vote against him because they don't like the Law and Justice government. Okay, and this is the problem. You know, he's very associated with the government, with the balance of public opinion being, you know, very, very evenly divided between supporters of opponents of the government, which means it's going to be a very closely run thing, and was always, apart from that very brief period in the pandemic, going to be a closely run thing. His second major weakness is that he has been fighting this election for a long time and has been constantly having to adapt to a changing situation. He expected the election to be May the 10th, and his timeline in terms of the campaign was geared up to culminate in May the 10th. And suddenly he's had to fight an election that's 6 weeks longer. You know, he's had to find the energy, the ideas, whereas Rafał Trzaskowski has been able to come along very fresh with a lot of energy. He's expected his main opponent to be Małgorzata Kidawa-Błońska, but of course it's Rafał Trzaskowski, who's a very different, much more dangerous challenger for Andrzej Duda. He also expected his core appeal to be this trifecta that Law and Justice has sold to voters, of delivering on popular, high-profile social and welfare pledges, at the same time as maintaining strong economic growth and balancing the budget, you know, and indeed claiming a budget surplus for last year. And of course, the whole of the pandemic and the socio and economic fallout from this has created problems for that trifecta. You know, the Polish economy is going to shrink. We don't know about how much, for how long for. The budget is going to be in trouble because of the recovery program that he's, you know, the billions of zlotys that they're spending on that. And there's certainly no new social spending pledges. So he's having to recalibrate his program to face that, you know, very difficult situation. So I think, you know, that's the problem he's had. You know, he's been campaigning for a long time. He's quite tired, and he's had to constantly kind of recalibrate, reinvent himself. Okay, so for all of that, I think that, you know, to conclude, the fundamentals of this election are actually pretty much where we were before the pandemic started. You know, in many ways, we're kind of back to where we were in spite of all those changes. It's a very high stakes election for the governing party and for the opposition. It's going to be very, very close. It was always going to be very close. Even when Małgorzata Kidawa-Błońska was the challenger, the second round was going to be close. And the key driver to this, how people vote, is their attitudes towards the ruling party. That's why it was always going to be so close, because it was always going to be a plebiscite on the ruling party, and that's going to be the main driver of how most people vote, regardless of whether they like Andrzej Duda or not. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Alex, and thanks for giving us a very structured account of how it is viewed, or how can it be viewed from the governing camp, on both weaknesses and strength of the candidate and the ongoing electoral race. We'll definitely come back to you with several questions, and I do encourage you already to pencil down and even put them in the chat box and the comments and questions you might have, so that they are early on in the pool that will open for the Q&A session. But before that, there is Renata Mieńkowska account of the same situation, but seen perhaps from different angles, not necessarily from the opposition parties' angles, but some research and public opinion included. And then after your initial introductions, I'll have a kickoff question, and then we'll start Q&A. Renata.
Okay, thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me properly without any problems. All right. So thank you very much for the invitation. And I will begin, of course, with the question, what's at stake? Well, for the opposition, basically, the most important thing now is to deprive Andrzej Duda of power, and obviously is to launch the process of getting rid, to be a sort of really tough on that, of getting rid of law and justice in parent Poland, which for the opposition means two things. First of all, and by saying opposition, I mean the whole opposition, but obviously we understand particularly the civic coalition plus the left side of the political scene, because another story, and I will mention that, is the far right, let's say, part, and the Polish Peasants' Party. But the Polish Peasants' Party actually can be counted as the general coalition of those parties on the opposition. So apart from the far right party, which is the Confederations, and or Confederation with their representative Krzysztof Bosak, everyone else wants to get rid of Andrzej Duda. Actually, I think that Krzysztof Bosak and the far right party also wants the same. However, I'm more than sure that they already have started talking to Law and Justice on what deal they could make, speaking about, let's say, the well, giving a present of the votes which Krzysztof Bosak will get in the first round to shift them to Andrzej Duda directly. I'm not sure if they will succeed, but I heard that they have already started talking about some, let's say, some offer from Law and Justice to Krzysztof Bosak and Confederation for simply a sort of support for Andrzej Duda in the second round. However, he will not gain a lot because, according to the opinion polls, it's about 50-50 of those who will vote now in the first round, in the first ballot, for Krzysztof Bosak. Some of them want to support surprise, surprise, Rafał Trzaskowski. So the far-right candidate will most probably mobilize at least some voters to give their vote in the repeat ballot for Rafał Trzaskowski. But coming back to what's at stake, it's definitely launching the process of coming back to the status quo, which was the case before 2015, namely coming back from this extremely pro-American, let's say, foreign policy, shifting much more towards the European Union, getting much closer to the idea of the Weimar Dreieck, which is cooperation with Germany and France. And it's basically a sort of, in plain words, coming back to the Western type of, let's say, doing politics, meaning coming back to the values which are set up in the Treaty of Lisbon in Article 2. So it's also coming back, let's say, from the shift of destroying the Polish political system and breaking the constitution. Now, what's also at stake, it's obviously existence of the civic coalition and civic platform. So if Rafał Trzaskowski loses this battle, which is still probable really, there might be some serious change on the Polish political scene. And we might have really a sort of many efforts to at least restructure civic coalition, civic platform, towards what it's very difficult to say, because it will be most probably dependent on how much Rafał Trzaskowski would lose and so on. But this is a different story. In any case, at the moment, Rafał Trzaskowski, as the most serious candidate on the opposition side, is trying to avoid being seen and presented together with his party leaders, with Boris Budka and other, let's say, strongmen in his party. Definitely not with Grzegorz Schetyna. He doesn't want to get associated with any of them, which I think is quite a good strategy. So he's so what's at stake is also a part, I would say, of this political strategy. Now, it's not only Rafał Trzaskowski that is really serious now on the opposition side, speaking about the elections. There are also two other serious candidates, and the fourth candidate generally, which is of a huge importance, although his result will be, well, 8-ish, maybe 10-ish, something like that, speaking about the percent of votes. So apart from Rafał Trzaskowski, who's now the leader on the opposition side, also according to the opinion polls, we also have Szymon Hołownia, who is, well, let's say the TV guy who entered this battle when Małgorzata Kidawa-Błońska was still representative of the civic platform. And he was really doing very well. He was growing in support, but the support declined when Rafał Trzaskowski entered the battle, because it's basically a very similar type of voters that he attracts, Szymon Hołownia. But I mentioned him because there are opinion polls which state that in the second round, so in this repeat ballot, when Rafał Trzaskowski and Andrzej Duda are there, Rafał Trzaskowski is a sort of, might count on more or less the same amount of votes, while if it was Szymon Hołownia in the second round, he would win with Rafał Trzaskowski without bigger problems. So we have a kind of a paradox. The candidate that doesn't really have a chance to get into the second round would gain more votes than Rafał Trzaskowski, who is the leader. But this is meaningful only when we take into consideration the biggest, I would say, weakness of Rafał Trzaskowski, which is his political involvement. Obviously, it's his strength, speaking about support and, let's say, collecting votes and structure that he has on his back. But obviously, from the perspective of the voters, he's still associated with the periods of governing of Civic Platform and Polish Peasant Party. But this burden is not as heavy as it is in the case of Andrzej Duda, that's for sure. Now, speaking about the strategy of Rafał Trzaskowski, I wanted to mention also Kosiniak-Kamysz, who had a lot of chances, but he will most probably not be that meaningful. And the fourth person is Krzysztof Bosak, which I mentioned, the far-right representative. His voters might be meaningful in the second round because at least a half of them wants to vote for Rafał Trzaskowski, according to the latest opinion polls, which is surprising, but actually not really, because his supporters are not only homophobic, let's say, and whatever phobic people, they are also actually economic liberals. And this is a phenomenon. I mean, it's not a phenomenon if we compare them to the Republicans in the USA, but it's a phenomenon in Poland because they might simply, by wanting to show their no to this social policy of law and justice and Andrzej Duda, they may go and vote for Rafał Trzaskowski. But okay, that's I will put it aside now. Now, what else?
Renata, now please wrap up in one sentence or so,
sure.
because we need to.
Who are the voters and what are the chances? Well, the voters of Rafał Trzaskowski are, let's say, the modernists, those who want some change in Polish policy, those who want to come back to Europe, come back to liberal values, to open society, to the idea of the open society, and those who do not want to see the Polish society being so divided. And this is the core of the strategy of Rafał Trzaskowski. One of the 3 points, namely, we should do everything to somehow suppress this division among the Polish who support, let's say, this close society, those more nationalistically oriented, those who expect that the state will be strong, but then obviously there is a cost of that. And the open, let's say, part of Poland, those modernists, those who want to stay with the Europe and European values. But opinion polls show that 18% of those who more or less know whom they are going to vote for in the first round, they are not that sure whom they are going to support in the second round. But these are those voters that Rafał Trzaskowski will most probably try to address his, let's say, activities and his campaign too. The other 2 points is self-government. So the self-government and use of it in his rhetorics is extremely important. And the third thing is, let's say, being close to those values of openness and, let's say, well, also to those changes which we need to get rid of the results of the pandemic and the lockdown. So economy and anything that is related to support from the European Union. Okay, but I think that I will a little bit more develop it while answering the questions. So thanks a lot.
Excellent. We'll go off the record now, and thank you very much for